distinguished speakers. And before I introduce them, I want to say thank you to the many people and institutions that made this possible. So first and foremost, the Center for European Studies here at UNC. Katie Linder, the Executive Director, is sitting up there in the front row. Yay! And also Allison and Lily, who were a tremendous help. We also received funding from the Curriculum in Global Studies, the Department of Political Science, and the Chancellor's Global Education Fund. We are also in the time slot of the TAM Student Friday Lecture. If you're a TAM student, can you wave your hand around? Yeah? And for those of you who might be interested in the Transatlantic Master's Program, you can liaise with one of the students who are here today, or with Sarah Hutchinson, who's sitting up there, who runs the TAM program. And I'm also happy to answer questions. It is a fabulous program. Yes. So our speakers today are Professor Grzymala-Busse, here to my left. She is a professor of political science at Stanford University. She has a long career in studying political transitions in post-communist Europe, state development and transformation, and also religion and politics. And very recently, a series of conferences and a symposium on populism, which many of you will be reading in your coursework very soon. To her left is Grigore Pop-Eleches, professor of political science at Princeton University, who also has studied political change in post-communist Europe, and especially international political economy, the legacies of communism, and how communism affected political attitudes. Next is Dominika Kruszewska, who recently got her PhD at Harvard University, and she's a postdoctoral fellow now at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And her work centers on political participation and the importance of movement politics in today's interesting political world. And next to her is Snegovaya, who recently finished her PhD in political science at Columbia University, who is a postdoctoral fellow at SAIS at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And her research focuses on the economic positions of left-leaning parties and how populist and far-right parties have benefited from the shift of working class orders away from traditional left parties to what she calls the VPR, the populist radical right. So the way we're going to do it today is that I'm going to ask our panelists 3 or 4 questions, and after that we will open it up to your questions from the audience. The responses will be brief, and since it is decorative board season, if I start playing with the pumpkins, that means the orange one has come to the stage and it's time for you to stop. So, we'll be seated, so I hope if any of you have any trouble hearing, let us know and we'll work on the microphones. So the first question is the one that is the closest to my heart. What is populism, and why is populism linked to democratic backsliding? Why is it that politicians or political parties who use populism to appeal to voters, to win power, why is it once that they're in power, they seem to have a tendency of undermining democratic institutions? And we'll start with Anna and Milada.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So first, to define populism, I think the sort of definition that's been most widely used in the field is really Cassanudes. And he basically defines all populist parties as having 2 critical commitments. The first one is that they basically view the elites as an undifferentiated and corrupt, self-serving cartel, right? So political, media, economic elites are all bad, and they're basically out there to exploit the people. Secondly, the second claim that they make is that the people as such, therefore, need better representation. And of course, the populist parties are ideally suited to represent the people, by definition. Now, the reason why these parties are so sort of deleterious to democracy subsequently follows directly from these two commitments. Because first of all, they view formal institutions of democracy and even informal norms as basically sort of the creatures of this corrupt elite cartel. These institutions are tainted, they're not to be trusted, they need to be either cleansed or they need to be ignored and basically remade to favor the people, i.e. the populist parties. The second thing about the need to represent the people also presupposes that we have to define who the people are. And the answer that a lot of populist parties provide is a very narrow one, right? So vulnerable ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities are almost automatically excluded from the people, as are basically the opposition or people who don't support the populist party, who are defined as being treacherous and treasonous and opposing, after all, the will of the people. So what I would argue is that the reason why these parties erode democracy so much is because these kind of consequences are baked into their very definition. This sort of very sort of skeptical attitude towards formal institutions of democracy and the need to define the people pretty narrowly.
Thanks. You just took all my answers, so I have nothing else to add. No, but actually, very much building on Anna's point. I think these two components of populism, which is the anti-elite aspect and the sort of anti-institutional aspect, in a way sort of come to a head when these populist parties are in power, right? Because as long as you're an oppositional party and you rail against the elite, it makes sense because you're out of power and you rail against the people who are in power. Once you are in power, how do you keep this discourse up? If you don't keep it up, then you actually have to stand for something else, which is costly, potentially politically divisive, and then whatever. So you need to be able to keep this rhetoric up, and then who is the new enemy, who is the new elite that you need to fight against? And in some cases that can be the EU, or it can be Soros, or it could be whatever, but in a lot of cases it ends up being the media and the deep state, which much of the time ends up being shorthand for a lot of the institutions that stand in the way of populist leaders getting their way, right? So, and at that point, in a way, you get this fusion of these two elements, the anti-elite and the anti-institutional stuff, because suddenly the institutions are a central part of the definition of what this elite is. It's this incumbent, it's the people in the constitutional court, it's the people in the Federal Reserve and so on. And so you get this fusion. Why is it still effective? Which is I think, also an interesting question. I think part of it is because we have this massive deficit in institutional trust. And we've seen this, I mean, this has always been the case in Eastern Europe, and we're seeing it increasingly in developed democracies in the US and Western Europe and so on. I recently saw some statistics that basically in the US right now, the confidence in members of, in Congress has dipped below, and the politicians has dipped below that of car salesmen. Right? Those are the two least trusted occupations in the US, and they just went below the used car salesman. And you have very similar patterns in a lot of the rest of the, so at the point where you have this low trust in these institutions, these kinds of attacks are much easier to pull off. And I think I'll stop there.
I think that covers a lot of it, but let me just add that I think this idea that the populists are the one that get the popular mandate directly from the people, from elections, is what makes it much easier for them to attack institutions like the courts and the judiciary branch in general, because it's not an elected branch. And so it's easier for them to make this argument that these are the elites that are not responsive or accountable to the people the same way that they are through elections. And that's one of the first institutions that we often see populists going after. And I think it speaks to this idea of how people think about what democracy actually is, whether we think of democracy as being governed by like norms and laws that constrains majorities from imposing the will of minorities in every possible way, or whether we think that it should be a pure representation of the people's will, which is, and the majority's will, which is what the populists are arguing. And I think that's part of the effectiveness and the danger, because the courts don't have an enforcement mechanism and they rely on the norms, and so if the populists are successful in eroding those norms, then we can't really count anymore on the courts to restrain them.
Thank you so much. I certainly agree with what our esteemed previous speaker said, but I wanted to challenge the original question a little bit. So is it true that the populists are eroding democracy per se, or are they eroding the liberal democracy, specifically the institutions that are liberal in nature, such as courts, judiciary, and others? So me and Sveta Petrova from Columbia University, we have run an analysis of the perceptions, of the attitudes of the populist voters in Central and Eastern Europe. And what we find is, in fact, voters of the populist parties are not anti-democratic. They're, in fact, Democrats, and they think that democracy is working well when the guy is in power, the populist guy, right? Which makes sense, of course, and you'll see that a lot here as well, I'm sure. What they're not is that they're not liberal. That is, they actually have quite pronounced anti-liberal, conservative, traditionalist attitudes as measured, by cultural authoritarian characteristics. So from this perspective, I would argue, I would have I would question I would actually wonder if the question we're asking is correct. Is it really about democracy, or is it about liberalism that populists are eroding? Of course, you can counter-argue that the line between those two is quite indistinct. And what we notice, and here I wanted to reference the research by Mitchell Orenstein from UPenn, who actually complements, I think, my own research nicely, and I apologize for self-citing. Essentially, what I find in my dissertation is that when mainstream parties implement unpopular policies, specifically I focus on neoliberal austerity reforms, and end up eroding popular social programs, this is where you actually see a strong backlash, at least in the region that I focus on, East Central European region. And what the populist leaders often do when they come to power is that, in fact, they cater to those very demands. In fact, they create a lot of those, or recreate a lot of those social programs that were destroyed. And that's one of the reasons why which ended up essentially making the mainstream so unpopular. And hopefully, we'll get more on that, but I can just give one example of Law and Justice Party, which Orenstein shows does not really necessarily is very popular because of these traditionalist conservative policies. In fact, a lot of people in Poland have an issue with that. Where Law and Justice really gets its support is by providing those social programs, support for family allowances, and similar kind of policies that are extremely popular, specifically in poor regions of Poland. In this sense, we see that it is the populists are democratic in a lot of ways, and they are really catering to those demands to which the mainstream parties could not, satisfy.
So this might be a good moment to clarify what is liberal democracy. So when we think about democratic backsliding, we are definitely thinking about undermining checks and balances, undermining the courts. But what is, does anyone take a stab at defining the essence of liberal democracy?
Majority rule with minority rights, right? And I think the critical part is the latter, the minority rights, that there are still courts, legal rights, legal responsibilities, and legal constraints on what the state can do and what we can do to each other. Right, which is why you have courts and a free press and all the other sort of mainstays of protecting those rights.
Yeah, so definitely the minority rights also, depending on the definition that you use, just some modicum of rule of law, which again comes back to the institution. But to get back to Maria's question/answer, which I think is an important one, I think what you end up seeing in a lot of these places is that you start with peeling back the elements of the liberal democratic state, and you end up going against even basic democratic rules, right? So once you start completely controlling the media. We're not just talking about it not being a liberal democratic regime anymore. You're going against the fundamentals of what it means to have free and fair elections. Once you start completely using the state to intimidate opposition supporters into not giving money and so on, you're starting to undermine the basics of democratic competition. So again, slippery slope is always sort of a lazy argument, but there is a way in which you see this in Hungary and you see this in Poland and you see this increasingly in the US as well, is that you start messing not just with these sort of niceties of liberal democracy, but with the very basis of being able to have a democracy.
And I think, this is one of the powerful arguments that incumbent populists will make, right? They can argue, for example, if they get 51% of the vote in a referendum, or if they manage to get 51% of the seats in parliament, whether or not they actually got 51% of the vote, which they rarely do, that gives them the authority to speak for the people. And as Anna talked about, these people are by then defined very narrowly. And this is one of the reasons you see so many attacks, for example, on LGBT rights, because they are outside of the people, and also on ethnic minority rights and migrants. But I want to pick up on one more before I go on to my next question. Grigore, you mentioned about very low public trust in institutions. So any ideas about how in the next decade that public trust in institutions might be rebuilt? Why don't we start with Maria and go this way? You can be very short, yeah?
That's a really easy question. Well, we have actually discussed this yesterday. I think a lot of which we're observing is the representation crisis in which, because of, as for example, shows in her research, because of the failure of mainstream elites to deliver, to cater to the demands of certain social groups, on which I also focus in my research, and there's a lot of debate who those social groups are and what it is that they really want. But in any case, the failure of the elites to deliver to those groups has created this representation crisis in which a lot of social groups don't feel represented. As a result, and these social groups may not necessarily have their preferences very programmatically outlined, which I think one of the opportunities that the populist actors use in order to bore the agenda. So they're coming up with these vague statements that are broadly appealing to everyone who feels unrepresented in this society. So from my perspective, a clear policy response to this situation and a way to rebuild trust in the institutions is to try, for the mainstream parties, to try to pick up some of this agenda and also bring it back into the normal political space in which traditional parties operate. So from, for example, perspective of my own research, if we believe that certain groups are unsatisfied with the economic policies, this is the way for political mainstream to go, such as left parties, for example, to go back to their traditional programmatic commitments, and instead of implementing sharp austerity reforms, perhaps try to deliver to the demands of those social groups. We just had an article published with Sherry Berman, who is a great scholar from Columbia who works on similar topics, showing how in some cases the rebranding of the left parties tends to be quite successful. And going back to the original programmatic commitments, for example, although this may be debated, for Labour in the United Kingdom or for other left parties in other countries, actually it ended up being quite successful. They've been able to successfully win back some of their former constituencies away from the PR, from the populists. So that in turn essentially brings politics back to normal and limits the political opportunities available for the far-right or populist parties. The same has to be said about the immigration, although I'm sure Anna will talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question, right? But I agree with Maria that a lot of it is about addressing some of those concerns that the populists have exploited in terms of economic insecurity. But I think it's challenging to think about, right? Because there are a lot of questions to be asked about whether we can even think about return to manufacturing and coal mining is making sense, right? And so I think we need alternatives to build sound policies around that issue. I definitely think we need to be having a conversation about immigration to restore the trust into mainstream parties. They can't skirt around the topic. They have to come up with policy solutions that try to address those issues. But I think some of the cultural and identity questions are going to be more difficult to resolve because, of course, they need to try to make that part of their program too. But how do they speak to those disenchanted parts of the population without actually giving up what they think the multicultural and progressive identity of the nation should be? And it might take some time for some of that, I mean, for some of the European nations. It's a relatively new realization that there are now multicultural countries. And I think it's going to be hard to navigate what kind of identity do we build that's not xenophobic, that's not exclusionist. And I think the mainstream parties have struggled with this challenge of providing an alternative vision that resonates with people and that gives them something else to identify with that's liberal, it's not exclusionist, but that's also something that they can find themselves in. And I don't think we have those answers, but we're going to have to come up with them pretty soon, I think, if we want to address the situation.
Yeah, I think those are very, very good, important points about this sort of question of representation and what kinds of issues can be brought up. I think part of the problem is that, especially when it comes to economic policies, the constraints that are inherent in everything from IMF conditionality to various EU rules to just not having capital flight and so on. And this is Anna's work and others sort of shown is that you end up with this very narrow band of acceptable policies. And we've seen this not just in Eastern Europe with all of these leftist parties that implemented neoliberal reforms. We see it in Latin America as well as Sue Stokes' work and others, right? So these constraints are narrow and it makes it very hard to have these kinds of policies in the absence of a sort of much broader change in the sort of international constraints and so on. I think the other aspect, though, where a lot of this distrust comes from is issues of corruption. And there, again, if you sort of look at the survey data, particularly the stuff from Eastern Europe, the extent to which most people think that most politicians are corrupt in all of these institutions is overwhelming. And there are two ways of looking at this. Maybe part of the reason why people think that politicians are corrupt because a lot of them really are. And from that point of view, trying to clean up some of this is important. The question is, though, even if you clean things up, and there's an interesting sort of disjunction between how many bribes people pay versus how corrupt they think that politicians are. So one of the things we've seen in Eastern Europe is a pretty significant reduction in the amount of bribes that people have to pay in their daily lives. Yet they think more and more that everybody's corrupt, right? And so some of the question is, do people actually notice when things happen? And I think this is where sort of messaging becomes quite important. And Graham Robertson and I have a paper on Ukraine that looks at these police reforms that were done there. And what we find there is that people do notice. So in the towns where they had these police reforms, and they're relatively basic reforms, they just had these new police cars and people in new uniforms and so on, but they're fresh faces and they don't do the sort of extractionary stuff that the previous traffic police did. And you see in those situations that not just the sort of corruption perceptions vis-a-vis the police improve, but there's actually a knock-on effect on national institutions, including the parliament and the president, right? So people notice and they're willing to give some credit. But then, of course, you're in Ukraine and everything else that these institutions are doing is incredibly corrupt. And by the end of sort of 2 years later, this is a way too small of a bucket, drop in way too big of a bucket. And so changing these perceptions is going to require more in terms of real reforms, but also it might require a little bit changing the way we talk about it. And when you look at certainly the Romanian media, there's always some corruption scandal and so on. Of course, it makes for good stories, but it's a little bit hard to know how we're going to start rebuilding this unless we maybe talk about some of the more successful cases and so on. And now I worry that I start sounding like people who say that we need constructive criticism and good coverage of the government, and the mainstream media attacking the good politicians. But there is a bit of an element of that I think needs to be addressed as well.
So I totally agree with what my predecessors have said. The only thing I would add is that, so in the initial studies of transitions to democracy, everybody obsessed about the losers of the transition, right? That the losing parties and the losers of the elections would basically comply with the outcomes of the election. And I think what the recent crisis has taught us is that we also need to focus on the winners of the election and how can they can self-constrain themselves. And so I think a large part of what we'll have to focus on, a large part of the solution, will be with the incentives for the electoral winners to constrain themselves and not to exercise their power in the kind of ways that Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziba describe as being profoundly destructive of democracy. How do we do that? I haven't gotten there yet. But I think that's something to look for.
I guess I agree with everything everyone said, and so I just feel a little compelled to put in a good word for mainstream political parties, because in a way, we talked about this last night, it's a push and a pull. So you can say that mainstream political parties have pushed voters away by not representing some of their interests, or on things like, for example, economic security and jobs and immigration. But you can also think about how populist and radical right parties have pulled voters toward them. And sometimes they do that in ways that I think is very hard for mainstream parties to counter, because with the new information environment that we live in now, they are appealing to voters with things that are just not true, or that are in the realm of fantasy. So, to put it politely. So, for example, in Hungary, the last election campaign, the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and his party Fidesz, ran the entire campaign on Stop Soros. Does everyone know who Soros is? So Soros is a Hungarian-born financier. He's a little bit like a Warren Buffett type figure. He made an enormous amount of money making various financial investments and deals. And ever since the collapse of communism in 1989, he has spent an enormous amount of money on education in post-communist Europe. So including Viktor Orban himself, who had a Soros scholarship. So how many of you here have had a Soros scholarship of some kind? Anybody? I have. Dimitar, Martin, maybe you're too young. Anyway, if you go across Eastern Europe today, almost half of the elite will have had some kind of a scholarship from Soros. But now he's been turned into this evil international actor who's trying to destroy Hungary and Europe. And he's Jewish, and so there's a lot of anti-Semitism that's coded or not so coded. And the last election was about how Soros wants to import 1 million Muslims a year into Europe in order to destroy European culture. And so the billboards all across Hungary said, "Stop Soros." Another example is Brexit, right? Where you have this fantasy of a wonderful Britain after leaving the European Union with a lie written on an enormous bus. And if you open The Guardian right now on your computers, you'll see that it's very hard for the mainstream parties to counter what was essentially a kind of fantasy type of appeal related to Brexit. So, I have so many questions. So I think I'd like to pivot now to European integration and ask the question, and I hope there'll be follow-up questions about this. It's a very broad question. It looks like right now Hungary is no longer a democracy. It's really an authoritarian regime. There's no free press. A lot of basic freedoms have been greatly eroded. And the United Kingdom looks like it's leaving the EU. But if we bracket those two cases, do you think that the rest of the EU might emerge stronger in a decade for having gone through this kind of moment of soul-searching about representation, about some countries, well, having to deal with Brexit, having to deal with incumbent populist regimes.
So I would hope that they do, but I'm not sure at this point that we're there yet. I think
That was an optimistically phrased question.
yeah, you know,
Feel free to turn it around.
I lose my Romanian citizenship if I'm too optimistic. But I think, look, so I think the legitimacy of Europe is crucial in all of this, right? Because this is in a way what kept the populists and the nationalists at bay in the 90s. Is not because the voters of Eastern Europe were terribly progressive or terribly liberal, but because they wanted to get into the EU, and they knew that if you want to get into the EU, you cannot elect certain types of people, right? And so, in much of, less so in Hungary, but in much of the rest of Eastern Europe, still the EU is significantly more popular than the national institutions. And that is one of the saving graces, because it still gives the EU some degree of authority, tarnished as it is by the handling of the global financial crisis, by the immigration crisis, and so on, but it still has this legitimacy. But then the sort of question is, how do you, what does the EU do with its power? And I think the big problem in the case of Orban was that Orban basically flew under the radar. So I don't know if it's a question of strength, though strength is an important part. It's a question of awareness. And with Orban having come out of a relatively mainstream, initially liberal, then sort of conservative background, he was a known entity in Brussels. People thought that he was okay. He was certainly, he was not part of the usual suspects. People were worried about the Romanians, the Bulgarians, the Slovaks, and so on. And so it's like, the good student who cheats, and you're looking at the other ones who you're worried about. And so when the Hungarians did this in 2010 and then on, the EU was completely unprepared. And I think the one other aspect that I think is important is the role of European political parties. Are you getting the pumpkin? But the role of European political parties in disciplining or not disciplining their members. And the Popular Party has not, the EPP has not dealt with the Hungarians, with Fidesz, nearly sort of sternly enough. And that had significant, and it was for good political reasons, in the sense that they needed their votes in the European Parliament. But that really made a difference. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons why the EU has dealt more clearly with law and justice in Poland, because they're not part of the EPP, so they're not sort of, they don't have these kinds of allies. What's interesting is the fact that the European Socialist Party has sent stronger signals both to Fico and Smer back in 2006, also to the Romanian Social Democrats when they had their sort of populist, nationalist, and so on deviations. And so in some sense, I think that part of the European institutions could be quite important, similarly with the liberal and the nationalist and so on. So maybe this kind of awareness and sort of looking out for these things and trying to send signals at an early stage might be one of the things that we sort of get out of all of this.
I think on an optimistic note, which is not very Polish of me, I think the Brexit example is a warning to other countries. I think if any of the other nations were fantasizing about leaving the European Union, they now have a good example of just how messy and complicated and difficult that would be. So at the very least, hopefully that sort of sets a precedent that it's not a desirable outcome for a nation and could help keep the EU stronger because of that.
Thank you. I also start with an optimistic note, looking at the results at this year's European Parliament election. Everybody has predicted, the predictions were completely catastrophic. We were going to witness a populist wave which is destroy whatever is left of the European Parliament, and the results were actually quite decent. The populists increased their share from 20 to 25%, but they were nowhere near these catastrophic predictions that a lot of analysts made. So here it seems to be that the populists, first of all, increase their share primarily in the countries where they're in power, like Italy or Hungary. And it looks like we are approaching some kind of, tipping point, or at least the populist wave does not really seem to be increasing. However, a lot of the issues that we are currently observing, I think, have to do with the nature of the European Union itself. It is, at least from my perspective, quite an unusual international structure and quite unprecedented for the history of the humankind, in the sense that we, of course, this is a cliche point, but we do see a lot of economic integration, but not so much of the political integration. There's a lot of tensions associated to that, and it seems to be, to at least in some ways, that we are observing some kind of balancing, between national and transnational institutions that try to figure out the best way to go. And EU, unfortunately, at least part of the problems that we are witnessing right now are to be blamed on the institutional design. One of the reasons is that there's no really clear rule to leave the EU. So one of the problems that we observe with Brexit certainly have to do a lot with the UK domestic politics, but also have to do with the just lack of clear institutional rules, partly because it's also unprecedented. Similarly, EPP has been mentioned, but also a lot of the payments that the EU gives to the member countries tend to sustain those very populists that are so allegedly so damaging for the system, such as the case of Fidesz in Hungary. So I think that, first of all, there's good news in the sense that with the big wave of populism isn't happening. We seem to be reaching this the peak of this wave. At the same time, there's a lot of institutional problems that are inherent to the EU structure that would have to be dealt with. And I think it's also a good, outcome, because these are the issues that are really manageable. It's not something totally, totally incomprehensible. These are really clear institutional design problems that hopefully will be resolved as we go forward.
So again, very briefly, I'm going to be the pessimist because I want to keep my Polish citizenship. But yeah, I think when Milada asked the question, so bracketing Brexit and Hungary, how is the EU doing? It's kind of like that famous joke, right? So aside from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? And I think, because both of these point to fundamental weaknesses, right? Brexit isn't just bad because it's a symptom of the kind of populist resentment that we see sort of rising up across Europe. It's also really bad because Britain served as a very useful policy counterweight within the European Union. It was always the one who was against the deeper integration. It was always certainly the force against regulation. Its business cycles were very different from the rest of Europe. And so it meant that it was always sort of very useful and convenient policy counterweight within the Union that's now going to be gone. Secondly, I think Hungary and what's going on within Hungary and to some extent Poland shows sort of, the weakness of the EU with dealing with its own members, right? And shows how difficult it is to punish malfeasance. I mean, the censuring with Article 7 takes an extraordinary amount of collective action and consensus. And even with Poland, we didn't get past the first stage of the vote, much less, going all the way through all three stages. So I think, both Brexit and Hungary show some real weaknesses for the future of the EU.
I'll say something optimistic, which is, yes, well, and I am struck by the fact that right now we do have incumbent regimes, both in the UK and the United States. So first of all, the existence of incumbent populist regimes that are engaged in some kind of democratic backsliding is not confined to Eastern Europe. For a while, we thought when Hungary was first, after 2010, we thought, well, this wave of populism is a post-communist problem, and it makes sense, right? These are weaker, young democracies with weaker institutions, lower public trust, for good reason, because of high levels of corruption, a long and difficult process of joining the European Union. But then more recently, we've seen populists elected to governments in Italy, in Austria, in the UK. And right now in the US and the UK, we do see checks and balances working. Right? Boris Johnson was just in court in his government again today. The court ruled that he has to obey the law. Now, it is striking to think of in the United Kingdom that a court has to tell the Prime Minister to obey the law. And I think the Prime Minister is still planning to go around the law, so these are going to be very dramatic couple of weeks that my students and I are going to enjoy. But still, there is the checks and balances are working in here in this country as well. So I think one thing we might walk away from saying that there is a difference between how well institutions can respond to democratic backsliding in the East and the West.